Thank you to everyone who has connected. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. Gracias a todos por haberse conectado. Vamos a empezar en unos 2 minutos.
Hola, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. La conversación del día de hoy será en inglés, pero contamos con interpretación simultánea en español. En la parte inferior de sus pantallas pueden dar clic al botón del mundito para escucharla en inglés o en español. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Isabel Migoya, and I'm one of the coordinators of Convergence Lab, together with my colleague Mia Armstrong. Convergence Lab is a series of events Arizona State University organizes in Mexico, with the goal of exploring shared challenges and opportunities. We organize these events in collaboration with partners like our dear friends at the ITAM, who are the co-hosts of today's event. Many thanks to Alexandra Uribe and her team at the ITAM Political Science Department for everything they do. Muchas gracias. We're really excited for our conversation today, which will explore the resilience of the two-party system in the United States and in the context of the midterm elections coming up in a few weeks. So let me begin by introducing our panelists. We have Dr. Patrick Kenney, who is the Dean of ASU College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Vice Provost for Academic Enterprise Strategy and Foundation Professor of the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. Dr. Kenney is instructor of ASU courses such as Voters in America, and he has authored articles in the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and several others. He has co-authored 4 books: The Spectacle of U.S. Senate Campaigns, No Holds Barred, Negativity in U.S. Senate Campaigns, The Changing Face of Representation, and Taking Aim at Attack Advertising. I'm also happy to introduce Professor Jeff Weldon from the ITAM in Mexico City. He's a full-time professor in the Department of Political Science. His research interests include federal elections, congressional behavior, and local elections. Professor Weldon has authored articles in the American Journal of Political Science, American Political Science Review, Election Law Journal, Revista Este País, and Nexos. He has co-edited the books El Congreso de la Democracia and ¿Para qué sirve el Poder Legislativo? And moderating today, we have Fernanda Caso. Fernanda is an investigative journalist and political analyst. She's the host of the political analysis program En Todo Caso. In 2020, she covered the U.S. presidential campaign for Gato Pardo magazine. She's currently a columnist for El Heraldo de México, as well as the researcher and host of the podcast Semanario Gato Pardo. Fernanda holds a law degree from the ITAM and an LLM in national security from Georgetown University. And before we start, we would like to begin with 2 questions that will help us understand where we are at when it comes to the multi-party systems. So question number 1. What is the ideal number of national political parties in a democracy? The options are 2, 3 to 5, 5 to 7, or the more the merrier. And number 2, to what do you feel more affiliation? To a political party or to an individual candidate? So we're going to give a few seconds for the audience to participate. And we have some interesting results. People feel more affiliated to a political party than to an individual candidate. And with this fantastic lineup of speakers, I leave you in the good hands of Fernanda, who will begin this conversation. Thank you, Fernanda.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you very much to everybody who has joined this conversation. I'm very happy to be the moderator of this event organized by two institutions I respect and I admire a lot, the ITAM, which is my own home, my university, and ASU, which is a university I've come to learn about a lot in the recent years, and I've worked with for several projects, and I'm amazed by all the things you're doing and all the projects you have. So, well, thank you very much for having me here. And I would like to start this conversation addressing the main topic that we announced in all the publicity of this event, which is the two-party political system. I find it very interesting that it's not a system that is established in any laws in the United States, nor in the Constitution. And however, it's been in place for centuries now in the US. Some independent efforts have been tried in the past. None of them has been very successful. And I'm wondering if it's an effective, if it's the model, if it's the best model possible. And if there would be any chance to change it, or if future generations should just accept that this is the model that exists and just move within its boundaries, or if someone should try to change this. And an additional question I would like to put in the mix is, like, what are the effects a two-party political system has in polarization, if it has any? Is it a better system to control, or to avoid polarization, or is it actually making polarization worse? So I would like to start with you, Pat, trying to understand how you see things.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. So you're absolutely correct. It doesn't say in the U.S. Constitution that there'll be a two-party system or two parties or would be competing. But there is a thing in the Constitution called the unit rule, which for all federal elections, so House, Senate, and the presidency, they are single-member districts, winner-take-all plurality districts. Okay, that's the way the system is set up. And so that definitely biases toward two parties, right? Because multiple parties, third, fourth, fifth, five parties have a hard time winning a plurality when there's a two-party tradition that started right from the founding. And so with this rule, the unit rule, it makes it very challenging to have multiple parties in the United States and in other democracies that have that kind of winner-take-all plurality district. So what I mean by that is you don't even need a majority, right? You win whoever's competing, whoever wins the most votes is going to control that district, whether that be a House district for the United States or a Senate district or a state for a senator. And so that really has set up the two-party system in the US. And you're right, we have the longest standing, I think, same two-party system in the world, dating back to the Civil War, when the Republicans and the Republicans emerged in 1860, and the Democrats have been a little bit in place prior. And it's the same two competing parties. Now they stand for very different things than they did then, but nevertheless, there's two competing parties. How could that change? Well, that unit rule would have to be changed, most likely through an amendment to the U.S. Constitution would probably be the single most efficient, best way. And the rules around amendment changes are Congress has to support it, and then the states have to support it. So it's 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. So the two parties would have to vote to change that, and that's highly unlikely, I think, that that's going to happen. So I don't think that the U.S. is going to move in any time in the future, near future at least, as best we can predict, to a multi-party system. I think that's unlikely. So I'll stop there and I can talk about polarization a little bit.
Great. Jeff, what do you think about this?
Yeah, thinking about Mexico in particular, I agree with everything that was just said. But in Mexico, of course, there's nothing in our constitution or our electoral laws that say it's a multi-party system. It sort of assumes it will be. All you need is 3% of the votes to get proportional representation seats. And that's relatively easy for our parties. And we end up, right now we have 7 parties in our Congress. And it would be easy to get more. It would be relatively easy to lose a few of those. The real question is, how does this affect politics? And it affects, I think, a lot in Congress, where the parties do act sometimes independently, and they have to rebuild a new coalition every time, sometimes to get a majority to get something passed, which could be good if people are deciding, members of Congress are deciding their vote according to the people they represent or according to their parties. But recently it's been often they're deciding their vote based on the threats they get from the government. And so that would be a lot harder to do if it was a 2-party system, I think, than a multi-party system. When it comes to elections, though, for single executive offices, we've basically gone to what amounts to a 2-party system through the use of coalitions. And so AMLO has his coalition of parties. The opposition has its coalition. MSA might be by themselves this time, or they might be joining in the other coalition, or the PRI might join the Morena, who knows? But there's we still end up with basically 2 parties, and that makes it, I think, it easier for voters to vote, and we end up with relatively close elections, because it turns out that the weight of the parties is relatively close to 50-50 in most states. And the only exception to this is basically the election of the president, where we've consistently had 3 relatively strong candidates over time. That hasn't in itself led to necessarily a lot of polarization, but it does lead to lots of problems with voter coordination. And so there's been cases where, for example, in 2012, the PRI probably would not have won a second round, or would not have won if the opposition parties had joined together against the PRI. That wasn't going to happen. But we have situations where it's hard to get party coordination. It's hard to get voter coordination on elections, just because of the number of parties we have. So.
Thank you, Jeff. And well, I'd like to come back to you, Patrick, to talk about the polarization.
Sure.
The polarization that comes, probably, you will tell me if it comes or not, from the 2 political party system. But also, I would like to understand if everybody is actually represented in a 2-party political system, because you have the general elections, but you also have primaries where you get all sort of candidates, like really moderate ones, some other more radical ones. So does that work like as a laboratory for all the political expressions to come together and end up with one candidate? Or are some political expressions just not having any representation? So what do you think?
Right. So let's do that part first. I think one criticism of a 2-party system, for sure, and this would be true worldwide, is that some groups, some beliefs, some groups holding certain policy positions or other kind of political viewpoints, they are not going to, is exactly what Jeff was talking about. They're not going to hold seats in the U.S. Congress. They're not going to win a particular district, right? We have had a few independent senators, for instance, and an occasional independent House member. The most famous one currently probably is Bernie Sanders, right, who was an independent, but sits with the Democrats in Congress, but was a mayor, and then became a senator, a House member, and then a senator as an independent. Right? But he clearly appeals to the Democratic side of our political spectrum. So that's highly unlikely. And so in many 2-party systems, highly unlikely that representation will occur. So there's somebody voting on their behalf, speaking on their behalf constantly in Congress. That's just not going to happen easily in the United States. So what happens is elements within the parties tend to gravitate to represent those particular groups, right? So you do have historically, not right this minute, but historically, you've had senators and House members fall more evenly across the ideological spectrum on issues, role of government, spending, that kind of stuff. Currently, the two parties have sorted themselves into pretty stringent, Democratic, liberal-leaning, Republican, right-leaning beliefs and policies, especially in the US Congress. And it's what we call in our literature the great sort or sorting out. And so if you look kind of 50, 60, 70 years back, there are many conservative Democrats who represented much of the South in the United States, especially in the areas of the South that actually seceded from the Union back in our Civil War, 1860 to 1865. Okay, they were the Democratic Party at the time. Lincoln was a Republican, so the Democratic Party controlled the South for a long time, well into the 1960s and 70s. But they're much more moderate / conservative than other Democrats, like on the coast or even in the Midwest. All right, and so gradually those states became Republican leaning. Okay. Much more accurately representing what the citizens look like there, okay, on issues, social issues, spending issues, policy issues. And many of the northern Republicans, especially in New England and in the northwest coast of the United States, gravitated to the Democratic Party. So there's hardly any what we all would think of currently as kind of moderate, more moderate little left, moderate little right. They kind of lean moderate left or moderate right currently, and they are representing those populations in those states, which vary significantly in many, many ways across the United States. So California voters, by and large, do not look like Wyoming voters or Montana voters. They just don't, and they're represented by quite different people, and they coalesce to the farther into the spectrum. That's probably that sorting has helped drive kind of this intense polarization we're seeing, I think, partly at the congressional level, right? But they're representing people that have sorted themselves as well. Now, real quickly on the primaries, you're absolutely right. So the US system is complicated, if nothing else, right? And so the parties hold primaries, which are much wider in the number of candidates, and do pick up these differences among Republicans and among Democrats within their party who are competing for the nomination. Whoever wins the primary then represents their party in these winner-take-all settings. And many primaries are also plurality winner-take-all. There's some change on those, but whoever gets the most votes, there's sometimes some runoffs. Some states have runoffs. Alaska just used a system we've never had before in the United States, where it was rank ordered voting there and then a runoff. And so there's a little experimentation, but by and large, whoever's the most votes or one runoff, a majority between the top two, is going to represent the party. Because the parties have gravitated or sorted out, then the two parties are nominating candidates that are pretty ideologically different from each other and other parts of their party that fall in there, okay? And so you are getting some pretty conservative, pretty liberal candidates that are running. So there are some structural reasons, I think is what we're talking about. There are some structural reasons that are helping drive the polarization, not only because people believe people are sorting into these positions too, but there are some structural reasons that encourage it and probably help maintain it for a little while yet. One last real quick thing. Voters are, I'll come back to this in a minute, but voters are gravitating a little bit. Well, why don't I wait on that? When we go to voters, we're talking about the elite level right now, or the political level. Yeah, so let me wait on that. Yeah.
Okay, we'll come back to that. And well, to continue talking about polarization, I'd like to ask you, Jeff, what do you think about the polarization comparisons that exist between Mexico and the United States? Because I hear people all the time saying that we are as polarized as the United States. Whenever you say that the United States is polarized, that the population is polarized, someone comes up and says, well, in Mexico, we have the same problem. And I'm not going to say Mexico is not polarized, but to me, it seems that this polarization is built differently. In Mexico, polarization is built around people, like certain political actors, or around certain ideas or policies. Whereas in the United States, polarization is built around like deeper fibers, if I may say it that way, like around race and individual freedoms and religion. And, like people on one side, you tend to say that people on the other side are bad people, like morally bad people. Do you agree with this distinction I think there is, or do you find any other differences? And I would also like to ask you, like, when do you think these polarization tendencies started, not just in Mexico and the US, but it's something we're seeing like all over the world? Like, when did it happen, and can it stop?
Okay. Polarization, I don't know if polarization can stop. Radicalization might be able to stop, but polarization is, just going into sorting people out is a little bit different. In Mexico, the biggest difference in Mexico, I agree with everything you said, that it's different in Mexico, obviously. And the big difference in Mexico is that we had the PRI forever in government with very little ideology. Pretending to be on the left. No one believed it. It was all, there was never something that was very highly ideological, and it's hard for many Mexicans to understand what's left and right. And AMLO says that anything that's against him is conservative, and everything he does is liberal. And, at the same time, he's cutting the government by huge, much more than Paul Ryan could ever do in the US Congress. And so, the actions are, don't fit any particular ideology very clearly. And so that makes it a little bit harder to do this. In the United States, things are sorted out on issues. So I think it's probably driven by more fundamental sociological things like race and so forth. But it's very clear that Republicans have it's easy to predict a Republican versus a Democrat by how they think on guns, abortion, taxes, et cetera, et cetera. All those things make it very easy. In Mexico, that would not be the case. And of course, we have parties that would join coalitions that are very different than we would expect them to be. So the very conservative evangelical party joins Morena to push for the candidacy of someone that they think has some affinity with them in López Obrador. And we have the PAN and the PRD getting together in elections that used to be on the opposite side of the ideological spectrum, or the voting spectrum, at least in Congress. Now they are running together, and they're actually voting together in Congress. And we have MSA, which is a very interesting party because they consider themselves to be a very progressive party, but they're representing probably some of the most conservative districts in the country. And so they have, there's issues, and everyone I think in Mexico, we don't really think too much about ideology. And most of the votes are driven by what the party leaders decide, and the party leaders are deciding for many reasons just beyond what the ideology of the party should be, or the historical ideology of what the party represents. And so we end up with coalitions from, after 2018, actually, if we put the map of ideology in the Mexican Congress, it's very, very different than it used to be. And so those are things that we have to really take into account. And I think that we do have polarization right now, and we do have some radicalization, but I would agree that it's mostly from the candidates. And it might be probably in both cases, mostly from candidates. And so, AMLO is extremely Trumpian in many ways, and down to the language, and down to, the enemies. The people who don't agree with me are enemies of the state. And he puts an ideological tint on it, and so he calls them conservatives. But we know that doesn't make much sense often. And so that's I think that it's just a total different thing. And I think it's really driven by the politicians trying to get the votes that they want. They believe that polarizing the electorate is good for them, and making enemies is good for them, and so forth. So.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Jeff.
Yeah.
Pat, what do you think about this idea that Jeff talked about how politicians use polarization for themselves. So it's not something that comes from the ground, from the citizens. You were going to talk about polarization in the citizen level, so I think that is a perfect
so
for you.
Yeah, sure. So in representative democracies, right, these two things are linked. No matter, the question is how tightly they are between the citizens and the politicians. So there's a big debate going on in the political science literature, but also among journalists, pundits, etc., about are U.S. citizens as polarized as the politicians, as the media. There's so many different media sources now, right, that are clearly supporting one party over another. And there are key funding sources, which is vital for U.S. elections, where the money comes from. And, this big Supreme Court decision half a dozen years ago opened that up. So there's very little control, almost no control over the spending, raising of money and spending by U.S. politicians. Okay. And so our elections have gotten astronomically expensive. And I don't see really any change in that in the near future. Okay. So the people who are funding elections, who are covering elections, and the politicians, they are pretty aligned politically around, and I agree with what Jeff said, around a set of issues. Some of it is just the role of government. What should be the role of government in taxation, in immigration, in the new energy economy? What is the role of government there? And then there's a set of highly emotional, well-charged social issues like abortion, school. Now, some things that we thought we had settled: school prayer, capital punishment. Those kinds of issues have started to pop back onto the U.S. agenda. Right. And the people that are supporting those, so if you think of the two parties kind of in this way now, vertical, right, from financial support, media coverage, and political attitudes and beliefs by the politicians, they are pretty tightly aligned. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. The question is, do our voters look like that? And there are a lot of people that say, no, the U.S. voters are not nearly as ideological as their representatives or the media or the funders. And now there are clearly maybe longstanding data from what we call the National Election Study. There's pretty clear that maybe 25% to 30% of the Democrats and Republicans are really very conservative or liberal, about a third. And it's pretty close nationally, not close in certain states. Again, this breakdown is quite different across our 50 states, but on average nationally. But then there are a large group that identify themselves as leaning toward a party or independent, weakly attached to the party. There's different ways we ask those questions, and it changes how we ask that. Okay, but a lot of people now think of maybe a quarter, sometimes a third, 15%, 15%, 25%, maybe a third. They're open to moving between the parties depending on the performance of the incumbent party, performance of the president, performance of the candidates in the states. And they're not as tightly aligned on these issues. They are on what we call retrospective evaluation. How are things going? So one thing let me give a concrete example, that most likely is going to hurt, it's hard to predict U.S. elections right now, but trying to predict what might happen here in the midterm. Is this inflation that we're experiencing in the United States is as high as it's been since the late 1970s, early 1980s. So there are multiple generations of workers and retirees that have not experienced this level of inflation. So are they going to punish the Democratic Party for that? We'll have to see. Okay, they might. Okay, I mean, our models would say they might. All right, so which party is better at battling inflation? That's kind of hard to sort out if you look over time, but they might simply look and say, I think we need a change. Well, the Democrats have overreached. Where a lot of the people funding those candidates and the media, they're talking about a different set of issues. They're also talking about inflation, but they're also talking about a whole nother set of issues that the voters have views on, especially if we ask them. But how impassioned are they about those at any one moment? That's hard to know, right? And there's really a big debate about this, about the candidates have gravitated a little bit too far away from the frequency of attitudes across the general population. Does that make sense? I think I hope I communicated that because it's really an important distinction. So those that are most likely to vote, those are most likely to give money, those are most likely to watch certain network shows or, cable or stream. There's certain things or go onto social media. There is an alignment there, but they're not probably a majority of the U.S. population, is what I'm trying to say. And that continues to be open to debate. You get a really talented political scientist who disagree with that. But on balance, a guy by the name of Morris Fiorina at Stanford's written probably as articulately about this as possible, arguing that the voters probably are not quite as polarized as the leaders are. And if the money wasn't driving those elections, those leaders might be more likely to moderate, but they've got to go where that support is, where the money tends to be found.
Yeah, it was very, very clear. And thank you for that. And I would like to ask you the next question, to start with you for the next question, particularly for something you just said about how the new generations have lived different experience from the past generations. And that's changing the way that the voting is turning out. And it's not just the age, but there are other components in these demographic changes that are having an impact on the voter composition. For instance, there's the Hispanic vote that's growing rapidly, but there are also other minorities that are growing rapidly and are changing the way that the elections turn out. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about these changes in the demography in the US and how they're going to affect the political composition?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So you're absolutely right. And so let's just do the Hispanic vote. So in the United States, that is the fastest growing minority population in the United States is the Hispanic population. And by almost all estimates, all the demographers believe that there will not be a majority population in the United States in the next several decades. There already is not a majority population in California, for instance. Okay, there's a plurality population that's still white in California, but there's not a majority population in California. One thing you got to think about when you look at the emerging Hispanic vote in the United States is that it very much depends on how long those citizens have been here, where they've come from. So the Cuban Americans in Florida vote quite differently than the Mexican Americans in Southern California, for instance, or the Puerto Rican Americans in New York are going to vote differently than maybe those living in the border districts in Texas. Okay, so you have to kind of think about these things a little bit about how long they've been here, when their families arrived. In the United States moved the border around a couple of times. Arizona's one, right? So we have people that lived in either Mexico or the United States, depending on where the border was drawn. And then in the growing size of the U.S. population, which is now in excess of 300 million, the fastest growing groups are immigrants, right? They're not United States like Europe has reached zero population growth among certain, or negative population growth among certain groups in the United States. So the fastest growing has been immigration to the U.S. Immigrants or populations tend to gravitate toward one of the parties and have for a long time. You go clear back to for the Irish in New York and Chicago, for instance, in the 1800s. So that's not a new trend, but that's not a new pattern, but the current trend is this population, which is growing faster than any other population in the United States. There's no reason to see that would slow down. I don't think it might level a little bit rather than the rate of growth, but it's not going to turn down negative, irrespective of what's being said about the border and that kind of stuff. There's all kinds of reasons that's moving upward. Right now, on average, Hispanic population tends to support the Democratic Party. That number is moving around a little bit between the percent, maybe in the low 60% range to the low 70% range. There is variability by the population about how young those people are or elderly they might be. There is variability around certain issues, social issues like abortion versus issues about employment and things like that, path to citizenship, worker path, there's all these different issues that sort that. George Bush looked like he might, George Bush II, between 2000 and 2006, before he really ran into a lot of troubles politically, did look like he might be able to gravitate, recapture some of the Hispanic population that actually Reagan had because of a big immigration bill he passed in 1986. We actually drew a little bit more of that population. But on balance, from the Obama years forward, they're going to be voting Democratic. It just, what's up for debate is what's that going to be? Is it 60% or 70%? What's it going to be? And in certain states, certain districts, certain House races, certain senatorial races, and certain presidential races, Nevada would be one, Arizona would be one, California would be one, parts of Texas would be one, parts of Southern Florida would be one. They're going to shape the outcome of that election. So they're especially if they vote at that higher rate, 60 to 65, because the white population's not, they're not behaving in that kind of voting block, right? They're varying by a number of other things that you do not see 60, 65, 70. African-American population, yes, they're voting 90%. Jewish population, very small in the United States when you look at the whole thing. They're voting in the high 80s, early 90s probably. But then way smaller. And the Hispanic population is outgrowing the African-American population. So it's a vital voting block, and you're going to see, depending on where the politician's coming from, it's a vital voting block for them. There's no question. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah, I was looking into the Siena poll in the New York Times about these. It was really, really interesting. And what I found basically is that there's not much of a difference between the average Hispanic voter and a Democrat. Except that they seem to be a little bit more Trumpier. And the question is, how long does that last afterwards? I think what's really going to be important is to, not just separate them by national origin, but really by the place where they are and what they're doing in those places. And so the Southern Texas Mexican Americans are obviously very different from those who are in Nevada than probably those in Arizona. And so I think that's the way that the politicians, and particularly the Democratic Party, needs to be addressing the issues of the Hispanics in those particular places. Not just assume that everyone's going to be like the Californians or like the Puerto Ricans or something. They have to really, really think about how these specific issues are going to be working for the specific interests of these groups in those particular areas. And then, and I don't see that happening all the time. I think that that's something that needs to be worked on more.
Can I follow up on Jeff's point?
Yes.
Great point. Okay, just quick follow. So a famous Speaker of the House here in the United States by the name of Tip O'Neill always said all politics are local, which is what Jeff is alluding to here. There's been more nationalization of our politics than local politics, but his point's an excellent one. So if you look at the Southwest of the United States, the Four Corners region, you have Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico are all trending, some more recent than others, Democratic. Okay, big D Democratic. They're trending Democratic, and a lot of that is due to the Hispanic growing Hispanic population there. But they absolutely vary slightly on the populations there, especially compared to Southern California or southern parts of Texas. When you look at the U.S. map and you think, okay, where's a solid, if you take a presidential election and you say, can I count on votes? Democratic Party is looking for that spot to help replace what they once had up in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and maybe Michigan and maybe Pennsylvania. There's way too many votes still up there, which settled the 2016 and partly the 2020 election. But the state that tipped Biden over was Arizona, the call in Arizona, which turned out to be kind of controversial call here in Arizona, led to a recount. But so the question is vital. We need to understand more about it. Trying to survey this population is complicated. How long they've been here? Are we surveying them in English or Spanish? There's all kinds of things that pollsters, political scientists, and politicians need to do to understand the particular concerns, worries, things about this. A lot of it depends how long they've been here. Was a great point by Jeff. I mean, how long is their family? Some of the family's been there like 200 years, right? I mean, that, and others, as you know, are under the DACA exemption by President Obama. They've been here a long time, but there's a fear they might get sent home. But what really home is the United States for them, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot to happen over the next at least 2 decades in this area and around these voters and around these issues.
And well, this discussion takes me to a question I've had for a long time. You know, like we talk about all these considerations we have to make when we talk about the Hispanic vote, right? Like, how long have they been in the US? Do they speak Spanish or English? Where do they live? What country is their family from? So if you have to split this vote that much, is it still a category by itself? Like, does it make sense? Like, if to understand it, we have to make all these questions and separate it in so many parts, then does it even make sense to talk about the Hispanic vote as the same way as we talk about the women's vote or the Black voters? Or is it just a fiction that's being created from the outside? And I say this because last week I heard about this organization who's putting money into creating a Hispanic identity among voters, so that will help a certain political party. It just all seems so like unnatural, fabricated. Jeff, what do you think? Does it even make sense, or is it just like any other voter and it's just Hispanic?
It makes sense for totally non-electoral reasons, and it has to do with the census. And so the census tells us where people with Hispanic backgrounds live. And that is important for questions of redistricting and things like that. It's a critical piece of information, and that does lump everybody together. Obviously, when it comes to politics, they're going to be very different. And I would, it's interesting to maybe look at the national numbers every 2 years and see where they are. I don't expect them to move very much, but what's really probably much more important is, what's happening in Southern Texas, what's going to happen in Las Vegas. That, for me, that's much more important, and it has a lot to do with issues that they care about, and a lot of household issues that they care about. Instead of trying to separate everything out instead of trying to lump everyone together. Obviously, we can't lump them together politically. That's not going to happen. And and there's more and more groups. I mean, the Venezuelans that are coming in, how are they going to be voting? Like Cubans or not? Are the Nicaraguans, how are they voting, and so forth? Does it depend on where the country is that they're coming from? Under what the political conditions are, or what kind of refugees they are, economic refugees or political refugees or something. It's a lot of, there's a lot of things to be looking into. And that's actually much more fascinating, I think, than to lump. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But we have to, because of the census. And so we have these two things that are, two pieces of information that kind of conflict a little bit on as far as making logic out of everything.
So one follow-up on that, on the campaign side of it, is that because of the money, there's some highly sophisticated campaigns going on where they're doing a lot of micro-targeting, what they call micro-targeting. So they know who the voters are, their likelihood to vote, how they voted last time. They know what they tend to like. They're tracking them on social media, right? So these are the algorithms that are tracking them, and so they are tailoring messages, right, depending on who these voters are. They may be incorrect, but they are leaning to tend to do that, right? And then when it becomes so vital is when the races are so close, right? So there's several races. That Nevada Senate race is very, very close, for instance. I don't think the Senate race here in Arizona is that close, but there's several statewide races here in Arizona that are super close. There's the incumbent in Colorado was closer than people thought. So these voters, if they're not splitting 50-50, If they're not splitting the parties 50-50 and it's just 55-45 or 60-40, and that they think that micro-targeting on certain messages can help, then they're really focused on that, right? And the census helps organize the level of competition in any particular House district in particular. So every 10 years we redraw these, which they've always been highly contested, but that hasn't changed. They're as contested as possible now. So I've been stunned, former students that are working in these kinds of things and the big data. So I'm a quantitative political scientist, the big data that's out there available now. It's just pretty remarkable how sophisticated they can get them, talk to voters in certain ways that they think is going to help tip them more than 50-50, right, is what they're after.
And well, the next topic I would like to address has to do with the organization of the elections, which in the United States didn't used to be a hot topic. Like the elections were held every 2 years, and like everybody agreed on the results more or less, probably with the exception of the 2000 election, but more or less everybody agreed on how they were organized and the validation of the results. But that's changed in the recent elections. Results have been challenged and the election authorities have been questioned. And well, Mexico, we've had a bit of experience with that kind of situations. So I would like to ask you, Jeff, like, what do you think about the comparison between the two models? We have completely different systems. Could you talk a little bit about those differences and what are the strengths of a more concentrated electoral organization like we have in Mexico, vis-a-vis the system in the US where the states hold that power?
Yeah, and this is a really good question, and it's based. The Mexican democracy is actually based on the questions that we're seeing in the United States today. When our framers of our modern democracy, and I don't have to go back 250 years to talk about our framers. This was just a generation ago. When they were setting up the new institutions, they came up with the foundation that for Mexico to be democratic, the losers had to accept the results. And that if they were not accepting the results, then it wasn't going to work. And so they had to make sure that people had a lot of confidence in the IFE, INE, that they had confidence in the TRIFE, that they had confidence in that the government wasn't buying the elections directly with, by putting money into the campaigns, and so forth. And this required, if there was this confidence, then we would be able to say that, yeah, Mexico's now had a democratic transition. And part of this wasn't just to get, the opposition parties to accept defeat. It was mostly to get the PRI to accept defeat. And to do that, it required a huge IFE. We have an enormous electoral institute here. But it had to be big. And this is something that everyone is repeating all the time. It has to be really big because the PRI is really big and the PRI controls everything. And so you have to have something that would be able to stop the PRI from spending too much, that would create confidence in the elections, to create a totally independent and reliable party registry, voting registry, and our credencial de elector, all those kinds of things. And so we have this enormous IFE, which is very expensive, but is very reliable and still has a lot of confidence in the population. This was challenged, of course, in 2006 in a similar way to what Trump has done, but much less violent, obviously, and much less sustained. AMLO just decided to keep on running, but there was a response to it also. So after that, there were responses to the election of 2006. There's responses to the election of 2012 that actually concentrated in some ways more power in the INE, made it bigger. Eventually, the INE took over much of the parts of the elections in the states, and so it has we end up now with an electoral system where everybody knows who's in charge of elections. We believe that the people in charge of elections are relatively reliable. It's not something that's controlled by the governors like it used to be, and it's not controlled by very local things. And then one of the most important parts for me for the way that we run elections in Mexico is that the votes are actually counted by the people, and everyone knows that. So it's the people who go and are running the elections, the citizens from each of the precincts go to elections, and they do all the counting of the votes by themselves, and they report it. And I think for me, that's much more reliable than having some kind of electronic system or something where I don't even trust the INE, who are usually my friends, to do the right things all the time. And so right now we're in a situation that I can talk about this in the next round maybe, but we're in a situation that this might change. And AMLO is attacking the INE in a way that the PRI never did. But for me, it's very sad to see that the thing that we structured our electoral institutions on, that, the losers have to accept defeat, is the basic problem in the United States, where we have some 300 congressional candidates who still do not accept that Trump lost. And so that's a serious problem in the United States. And I hope that we don't go in that direction with any reforms that we're going to be doing here. Anything that would weaken the electoral authorities to the point that people no longer trust the results.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I would like to ask you, Pat, about the US system, like the challenges you're facing, and also the role that these midterm elections are going to have in how the authorities for the 2024 elections respond to whatever challenges come.
So one thing that's always been contested in the United States, frankly, across our whole history, is who is eligible to vote. So, but we're going to set that aside and talk about the counting of the ballots. We thought we kind of had that settled in the United States after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, pretty much cleaned up a lot of stuff that kept people from voting. But that's again being contested in various ways about who is voting. Some of it is what we were talking about earlier. It's a polarization of the parties, right? And so if you absolutely know if Hispanic vote is going to be up and it tends to be Democratic, then there start to be questions about, well, who are these folks and who's voting and that kind of thing, right? So if it didn't make such a big difference, they probably wouldn't be quite so worried about it. But that's also back under discussion here. It had quieted down for the last 30 or 40 years, by and large, compared to the history before. What is definitely new for us in the United States is what just happened. What was worried about in 2016 and definitely happened in 2020. And that is a highly decentralized system. So the US Constitution gives the power of running the elections to the states, which actually on many states historically turns that down to the counties. So there's thousands of counties running these, lots of volunteers. My mother, who died in 2005, so it's been quite a while ago, but well into her 70s, was a poll worker in a little precinct in Iowa, and had cookies and visited with people coming in and knew everybody coming and, how's your older son doing and all that kind of. That would repeat across the country in many ways in various locations across the country. Secretaries of state in most states oversee the vote. And Jeff's term is exactly right. The United States has had a long history of, especially in the modern era, of the losing party, the elites of those parties, in particular, the candidates, of agreeing that they lost. Okay, we have quite a bit of survey data that shows, and this just makes sense among like athletics and everything else, that if you're on the losing side, you tend to doubt maybe that you lost for all legitimate reasons. But it's important to think about that because we have some survey data that shows that back quite a while. And if you combine that with there is a US populist part that's a little conspiratorial minded on top of that, right? So, my first political memory was the Cuban Missile Crisis, but my second was the assassination of John Kennedy. I was in elementary school and I was in a Catholic school and they came and had us pray. The president had been shot, and about an hour later they came and said he had died. I remember that like it was yesterday, right? And And the US still struggles with how did that happen? Who was responsible? Was it one gunman? Was it multiple gunmen? Was the CIA? It goes on and on and on. All these different conspiracy theories that last 60 years later, really, right? So if you combine that at the individual political level, the citizen level, you can tap into that. I don't think we thought much about that because politicians didn't tap into that on purpose. So Nixon, highly competitive race in 1960, 100,000 votes separated him. He walked away from that, and supported Kennedy. Humphrey lost by about, I forget now, but give or take 300,000 votes in 1968. Very close election. Humphrey walked away from that. The only challenge we ever get really in any of this is in modern times is Gore. But remember, that boils down to one state. All the recounts show it's under 1,000 votes, over 6.2 million casts. And there were some counties in southern Florida that had quite different, right in the same state, counties lined up on the Atlantic coast had different structures to their ballot, for instance. So this became very contentious. It wound its way through the courts to the Supreme Court that said, no, Bush has won. We're going to stop the recount at this point. And Gore went out quickly, within an hour, and supported the Supreme Court decision and asked his people to support Bush. So that's completely different than what we started to see in the debates and during the campaign in 2016, where then candidate Trump raised issues about the voting, counting, but we're not about. He's also raising questions about who's voting, but about the counting. And that extended right into 2020. And he started sowing those doubts early in the campaign. Ironically, by the way, I was involved in a pretty good, interesting study that, he really pushed hard that you should not trust mail-in ballots. And he was asking his supporters to go out on election day. Okay. Well, election day, there's a lot more hurdles of voting on election day than voting by mail. And many Republicans and Democrats throughout the country, Arizona's one, have been voting by mail for a couple of decades, where people felt comfortable about it and do it. Okay. You can, take your time. You can mail it in ahead. You don't have to rush out there and all kinds of stuff can stay, even if your intention is to vote. Your child becomes ill, you get called into work if you're a doctor, you forgot. I mean, there's all kinds of things goof you up on election day. Where if you can handle it at a better pace, then turnout tends to be higher, right? And so, but he totally it looks like from some data, he miscalculated the worry about the pandemic. This is pre our vaccines. So you're asking voters, especially elderly Republican voters, don't vote by mail because you can't trust it, even though they've been voting by mail, and go out and vote. So he probably lost some key votes in some key states with that message, even though that wasn't his intent. He was just trying to sow doubt in the election itself. So, the court system stood by what happened in the states, right? I forget the number. I should have looked it up for this, but something 60 plus challenges in the courts all said the votes were fine. So other institutions in the United States have said that the vote was fine in 2020. But Jeff's point is right. This New York Times article actually totaled up all the Republican candidates who disbelieved the outcome in 2020 because of voting. It's in the hundreds. And some of those will be elected. And there's many running in states that are going to try to bring counting reforms, probably. So the United States is most likely in for a bit of a bumpy path here. President Trump was not at the inauguration. That's completely unheard of. He never endorsed the new president. Again, unheard of by our norms. Not in the Constitution, but that's our norms. That goes all the way back to Washington, who didn't have a term limit. He just stepped down on his own and started this long tradition. And it just really, we've had some highly contested elections, like 1876, highly contested, and a huge mess about who won. Huge mess, but it's also a very long time ago. So if you take the modern era, this is going to be a new challenge to the United States. And Jeff's question is exactly it. Will the people who lost the election, especially the candidates, the supporting media, the supporting funders, will they buy those outcomes? And that question's up for discussion, frankly, coming into this midterm and into 2024. Yeah.
I'd like to make one final comment. Yeah.
Before we go to the questions from the from the
Yeah.
audience. Go ahead.
It's just very brief comment. To me, it's amazing that it's easier for me to vote. Where the effect of the election is important as an international, as a person of the world. But it's not directly affecting me than it is for a someone who works in a warehouse in Amazon in a whole bunch of states where there's no early voting, there's no absentee voting.
Yeah.
It's just amazing, and it's a little depressing that that's the case. I'm very happy to vote, but I'm voting for scientific reasons more than anything.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who are not unable to vote on Tuesdays because for just real structural reasons.
Yeah, no question.
So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna pass the ball to Isabel because we're having some questions from the audience.
Yeah, we could spend another hour talking about this, but sadly, we have limited time. So before we go to the questions from the audience, we have two more poll questions. So we ask the audience to participate. So these questions are, number one, do you think Mexico would be better off with only two major political parties over the long term? Yes or no? And number two, do you think US politics would be more or less polarized with more than two viable political parties? So we have a few seconds to answer here. And here we have the results. And I'm surprised by the first one. Very, very close answers. And now let's move on to the questions from the audience. And we have one for Professor Jeff. This question comes from Jorge and Jose, and they are asking, could a two-party system be a reality in Mexico, and would that be desirable?
I don't know if it's desirable or not. Again, in practice, elections are basically held on a two-candidate basis. Put it that way. And I think that, and I think it's relatively likely that we'll see that in the 2024 election for the president. Is it viable? No, I don't see it viable. The opposition parties are representing lots of different groups. Morena itself is actually representing a whole bunch of different groups. Morena is very much a catch-all party in many respects. And the opposition parties are going to be doing, I think it's very hard for them to organize into one party in that sense.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And we have another question for Dean Kenney. Is the U.S. Electoral College a stabilizing force in American politics or something antiquated whose time has come? This is a hard one.
Yeah, so that's a heavily debated in the United States for a long, long time. It's unlikely to change. Let's put it that way. So rather than tell you how I think about it, but it's highly debated. We do every other election pretty much now by popular vote, and pretty much we do that way. And so it probably would transition pretty easily to a popular vote. There would be discussions about whether it might bring out a number of other candidates, and you might need a runoff for the top. But again, you would need a constitutional amendment, okay? And the Electoral College favors the two parties because of the things we talked about earlier, and it favors the smaller states who are actually, we can get into the math of it, but they're actually overrepresented in the college. They're overrepresented in the college because what we call the constant two, where every state gets two members in because they are every state gets two. So you do it by population in California, 30 plus million. In Wyoming, I don't know, maybe 30, let's make it easy, 300,000 people, give or take. But then you add, so Wyoming's going to get one, California's going to get 52 or something. Then you add two. So actually the weight from the small states tends to be a little higher, okay? So again, to change our constitution, 2/3 of the Congress, all Democrats or Republicans, okay? except for a couple. All right, and that's unlikely. And then 3/4 of the states, and there's 3/4 of our states, getting to the, changing that would be highly unlikely. The small states would be giving away influence. And so we debate this all the time. They could tinker with it and change some stuff, and some states have started to do that. So we might be able to, at some point, pass an amendment that doesn't change it wholesale, but allocate some votes a little differently depending on who wins the state, that kind of thing. But only Nebraska and Maine have tinkered with it, and so 2 pretty small states. It doesn't mean in a super close race they're not important, but I think it's unlikely. It's unlikely, even though we're looking at 2 of the last since 2000. The popular vote winner, Gore and Clinton, lost in the college, right? So Gore won by probably, depends, what source you're looking at, but well over 1 million. Hillary Clinton won by well over 3 million, and Biden won by over 7 million, right? And think about how close that was in the college. It was pretty darn close to the college, frankly. So that something like that may drive us, but we faced that before. We've had this a number of times, and we didn't change it. And as you look at the politics and the amending process, and there's not much of an incentive to change it. Let's put it that way.
Thank you so much. And Fernanda, we have a question for you. So you cover US politics and elections for the Mexican audience, and during the previous presidential election, you visited several swing states. So what was that for you? What was the most surprising thing that you saw?
Well, that's a tough question because I saw a lot of surprising things. I think probably what I just talked about how deep the political beliefs go to, I would say 2 things. Okay, so the first one is that how the morality plays a very strong role in politics in the US. That's something that we do not see in Mexico. And how Democrats talk about Republicans and Republicans talk about Democrats, as if it's a representation of the evil on earth. And probably they're not referring to the Democrat voters or Republican voters, but about the politicians on the other side. Like a Democratic voter will think that any Republican politician is like the worst in a moral sense, and the same way the other way around. And I think that's something that it's hard to understand from the perspective where I come from. That's not, I think that's not the case. So that made a big impression on me. And then probably another thing is the role that news organizations are playing and the news consumption habits in the different sides. Like someone who votes Democrat will never listen to or read any newspaper or website or anything that's related to the Republican side, and the other way around, it also applied. So there are no common grounds. There's no place where 2 voters will get information and have a true discussion about topics that interest the whole country. And I think that's, I don't know, it's like they're living in different worlds, even if they're neighbors, especially in these swing states where that actually happens. Like you have very strong voters on both sides, and they can live in just 2 houses that are one right next to the other, and they like the news they have, the reality they believe that's going on is completely different. There's no common ground in certain places, and I think that's something that really impressed. Yeah, made an impression on me.
Thank you, Fernanda, for your insight. And sadly, we're running out of time. So we want to thank everyone for joining us into our Convergence Lab, and a big Thank you to our panelists and our moderator for taking the time for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you to the ITAM for being our co-host. And if you want to keep up to date on ASU in Mexico and Convergence Lab events, please follow us on Twitter at ASU_MX. And until the next time, muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.